Hi everyone, welcome to another video. This is going to be for Unit 3. And today we're going to be talking generally about alienation and political economy using Karl Marx and Patricia Collins. And I want to try to explain my reasoning for developing the syllabus this way and why it is that, you might be thinking that we're kind of jumping from these works, in ancient Greece or in medieval Japan, right, to this much more contemporary stuff, right? Karl Marx is 19th century, so like 1800s. Specifically, the text that we're reading is a fragment from the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844. And then we're also reading Patricia Collins, right, who is still alive and still writing to this day, So we have a 19th century figure and a contemporary intellectual, and that's quite a bit closer than, everything else that we've been reading for the most part, right? Perhaps other than Martin Luther King, right? So what's the deal? Are we changing topics? Are we shifting gears? In my view, the answer is no. I want to kind of keep us going on the same sorts of problems, right? At least from my perspective, one thing that grouped together everything that we have been reading up to this point is that they all try to answer the question, right, of like, how do we deal with the fact that our lives involve death and suffering and so on, right? So Epicurus' letter to Menoetius, right? He's advising his friend about their fear of death, right? Similarly with the Phaedo. Dogen also wrote about, not fearing birth or death, and Martin Luther King also wrote about the willingness to accept the political consequences for justice, right? And so everything that we've read in one way or another is philosophy that sort of deals with the question of like, what do you do about the fact that the life that you live, you have to die, you're going to suffer, right? And you're going to, this is sort of the addition of this week, you're going to feel alienation, right? And specifically, I want to try to think about this concept of alienation because I think that this is a concept with quite a lot of like purchase, in our contemporary moment. You can think about the popularity of movies like Fight Club, right? In Fight Club, that is sort of paradigmatically like somebody that becomes so dissatisfied and alienated by their own life that, right, they would rather like be fighting all the time instead, right? And similarly with other sort of films that I think have centered this sort of like alienated male figure a lot of the time, right? Is like the Joker franchise, right? I think that is in many ways very similar in that respect, right? And so the reason why we're moving to this 19th and 20th century stuff is because I think that, one thing I really want to focus on for the entire class is like, what do we do about the fact that we have to put up with all of this stuff that I think that we can reasonably call like evil, at least in some way, right? We have to die, or at least we might feel that way at first glance, right? We have to die, we have to suffer, right? And then we have to deal with this sort of political stuff that I think is described by these philosophers as a kind of alienation, right? And there are lots of ways of sort of expressing this idea that our contemporary society is alienating, and they can move in a bunch of different directions, right? And so, in the Sartre that we're, doing the other video for the unit on, right, he sort of asked the question of like, if the sort of transcendent political authority that you provide to religion, that you provide to institutions, right, you get rid of the bad faith, right, and you take responsibility, then what does your life look like, right? That's the existentialist sort of perspective, right? And then similarly, I think that these two texts sort of also speak to what it means to navigate this sort of gratuitous suffering and evil in our own contemporary society. Okay, that being said, of course, we don't need to agree with them, right? They're just sort of like a jumping off point for us to begin to think about these kind of issues, right? Okay, so to begin with, right here I wrote, Karl Marx wrote in the 19th century and aims to understand the effects of industrial manufacturing, right? And then I wrote in this next sentence, Marx investigates political economy. And this is something that comes up rather quickly in the short piece that you read or are going to read, right? Marx is investigated in a critique of political economy. So what is political economy, right? So Marx is writing in a discipline called political economy that is somehow like between what we would ordinarily mean by politics and economics, right? Political science and an economics department. Essentially, what Marx wanted to investigate was the class structure of society, right? And so if you were going to analyze a feudalistic economy from a Marxist perspective, then what you would do is you would follow essentially the labor process, right? And just sort of analyze how economic affairs take place, right? So maybe peasants sow the land, right? They pay some sort of rent to a lord, right? That lord in turn has certain obligations to the throne, right? A political authority. And similarly, there's like the clergy, right? There's the bourgeoisie, traders, and so on, right? And so if you wanted to understand that society, so Marx claims, the way that you would do it is you would investigate sort of how goods and services are produced, right? How labor takes place, right? And so you would investigate things like the guild system and so on, right? Which is essentially, the feudal version of what we would now think of as a corporation, right? And so Marx lives at this period in his life where he is in the midst of this intense transformation that's happening in Europe, right? The shift from a kind of feudal economy into an industrial capitalistic economy, right? And Marx is living at the precipice of this transformation, right? The French Revolution had taken place, roughly 50 years prior, right? And so we're seeing this enormous transformation of Western society that definitely just hadn't taken place for thousands of years, right? And so Marx is now living at this moment of incisive transformation and essentially attempting to understand it, right? And that is why his work is relevant for us today. And something that I should mention, really, is that I would recommend as far as possible that whatever vision that you have about like what Marx's writing is like and so on that you had before this class, I would recommend that you just sort of like etch a sketch your brains and erase it, right? The reason why I suggest this is just because there's so much misinformation and so much like such a long storied like history of interpretive debates, right, and so on, that are so easy to, I think, decontextualize, right, that it can become difficult to engage with the work itself. And so I would recommend as far as possible that we sort of leave our previous understandings of this material and try to stay only to the text, right? There are plenty of people that are not communists, right? That are even anti-communists, that nonetheless agree with Marx's critique of the alienation that pursues from development of industrial capitalism. Even like figures like Adam Smith, you know, if you find the right sort of passages, will also sort of critique emergent developments in the emergence of capitalist society in that period, right? So, with that being said, you know, we're just trying to investigate a specific problem, and that specific problem is what is sort of the nature of capitalist society, and what is the relationship between capitalist society and alienation, right? Okay, and so Marx's central thesis is that the class structure of capitalist society produces alienation. Your reading will occasionally use estrangement, right? That's also alienation, as its inevitable result, right? So what does Marx mean by this? Well, Marx's central core belief about the nature of capitalism is that capitalism reduces all economic activity essentially to the relationship between two classes, which he calls the proletariat or the workers and the bourgeoisie or the owners, right? And so Marx's theory is that while feudal economies are so complex, right? There's lords and there's the bourgeoisie, right? Like traders, merchants, and so on, right? And there are peasants, and there is the nobility, right? And there's the church, right? It's a very complex, difficult political situation, right? Countries would the borders would be unclear, and you know there would be wars and so on, right? What is the sort of essential characteristic of capitalist society for Marx is that it reduces this sort of myriad differentiation of classes as it emerges in feudalism into only two classes, right? For the most part, there is, you know, Marx says there are those who have to sell their labor on a market, right, which defines as proletariat, and there are those who own the means of production, right? And here, you know, Marx has in mind especially manufacturing and factory production, which is taking over Europe, you know, kind of like wildfire, right, at this period, right? You have urbanization, so you have people clustering in these cities, right, where the main source of employment is this sort of contingent work at factories, right? And so Marx's theory is really a reflection of this 19th century situation where, you know, there's extreme precarity on the part of workers and extreme exploitation from the owners, right? Marx's sort of confidant and closest collaborator was Friedrich Engels, right? And Friedrich Engels himself studied the sort of Victorian period in England, and he himself was in charge of operating a factory, right? And so Marx was pretty well versed in this kind of material, right? And so essentially what the idea is that if you're in the situation where you have to sell your labor on a market, right, then you can't have any direct, like, intentional relationship to the product of your labor, right? If my employment is totally contingent, then I can't be attached to a certain kind of profession, right? And so Marxist scholars are often very interested in things like, you know, the emergence of sort of gig work, right? Where you have extremely contingent kinds of labor, you know, like being an Uber driver or DoorDash driver and so on, right? And so Marx's point is that if society is divided in such a way such that there are those who have access to the means of production, who then sell, that access essentially to the means of production to others, then they are always going to have control over what ultimately is produced, right? And so the proletariat, the workers, can only have an alienated relationship to their products, right? Their job doesn't have anything to do with them, right? And even though Marx intends to describe like a very 19th century situation, right? I think that it's very relevant in our contemporary moment. If you look up central core concepts in sociology, one of them to describe our contemporary situation is that of bullshit jobs, right? And what this category means, and it's an academic category, right, is that, you are essentially engaging in labor that is not productive, right? Just as an example of this sort of thing, right? I have worked various sorts of jobs over the course of my life, right? And one job that I had was essentially to move things in one sort of corporate software to another kind of corporate software, right? And I think that this is a kind of very common office job, right? Most corporations hire some contingency of labor that essentially perform this kind of function, right? And if you have a job like that, it's not even coherent for you to be attached to the product of your labor, right? It functionally has nothing to do with you at this point, right? You're essentially like a stopgap that manages the inefficiency of various software systems, right? So your labor is not actually productive, like it doesn't actually need to exist. And so there's no way that you could develop like an attachment. You can in no way think that like that was who you were, right? And so this is the situation that Marx is trying to describe, where in so many cases, essentially, there is no possibility, even really, of having an attachment to your labor, right? To think about your labor as being something that genuinely contributes to your own sense of self-identity, right? And so Marx claims that this alienates you in several ways. It alienates you from the product of your labor, right? Because you have no autonomy, right? You have no freedom in your decision about what you produce. It's something that's determined by someone else. You get alienated from yourself because you can no longer identify with your own activity. You become alienated from others because it becomes impossible to relate to others as people if you are forced to relate to them as commodities, right? Like if you're forced to think about people as potential threats to your own well-being, then you can't really be friends with them, right? And then similarly, Marx thinks that this kind of alienation alienates you from your humanity, right? Marx has this thesis that human beings are essentially socially laboring animals, right? We want to work together in some way, right? And what this kind of labor does is essentially prevent you from developing that sort of like common shared infrastructure or set of values, right? So this is Marx's thesis about the alienation of labor under capitalism, right? So now we're going to shift gears to Patricia Hill Collins on black feminist thought. And I really want to pause for a moment to think about like why did I include this on the syllabus, right? Part of the reason why I included this on the syllabus is because a good number of people that are in the class, right? This is going to be their one and only engagement with philosophy, right? And philosophy can easily sort of like give you the impression that like what philosophy is what these people in philosophy departments do, right? That they are philosophers in virtue of being hired by whatever university to teach it, right? Um, I want to challenge that view, right? Why do I want to challenge that view despite the fact that we ourselves occupy university setting? Well, because essentially, the power dynamics that are operative everywhere else in society are also operative in classrooms and university settings, right? Things like economic or racial facts about someone will generally be able to like tell you if they'll have an easy time getting through college or not, right? And so the university space is not essentially shielded from the political problems that exist in the rest of society, right? So what does that mean? Well, it means that philosophy, as a result, at least in its institutional forms, reflects in many ways the power structures that are operative elsewhere, right? That's to say, unlike other humanities disciplines, philosophy has traditionally done a very bad job of essentially diversifying, right? That unlike other disciplines, there's an enormous resistance to incorporating things outside of the traditional canon as being genuinely philosophical, right? And to me, from my perspective, from my own point of view, you can only think this if you are a sophist, right? If you are what Plato described as a sophist, right? Whether or not you are a pursuer of wisdom is not determined by whether an institutional body recognizes you as such, right? Um, and you can even see this in the history of philosophy, right? Even in like the ordinary or normal canon of the history of philosophy has so many moments like this, right? Where things sort of fall out of or introduced back into the canon, right? And so there's been a resistance in philosophy to think about stuff that is not like sort of either ancient Greek philosophy or traditional sort of establishment philosophy way that is basically an invention of the 20th century. They're like those are the only two things that get to count as philosophy. A good number of people that occupy positions in academic philosophy will tell you, for example, that they don't think that Asian philosophies can ever really count as philosophy, right? And that's because they don't do things like number their premises and so on, right? This is a claim by those people. My class is sort of structured and oriented by the claim that that is false, right? I believe that Dogen provides, for example, very serious arguments to provide the basis for philosophical reflection. And then similarly, the reason why I've chosen this Patricia Collins piece is because she really emphasizes that to discover the Black feminist intellectual tradition, you have to go outside of the ordinary established canon, right? Like what you would expect to be like traditional academic philosophy or whatever, right? And you have to turn to these other sources, right? Well, why is that? Well, because black women are historically excluded from institutions of higher learning in the United States, and there are an innumerable number of barriers to black women, especially in the past, to be able to, successfully live in academic spaces, right? Many very famous black feminist authors did not occupy positions in academia, right? And so what that means is that you have to go outside of the ordinary terrain of philosophy to really discover the theoretical value that this tradition gives you, right? So I've written up here, how do the political and economic circumstances affect the reception of black feminist thought, right? And in this case, I think that what Patricia Hill Collins points out is that the vast majority of black women in the United States are descendants of slavery in some capacity, right? And so they begin sort of excluded from civil society, right? And the gains that have had to be fought for have been meager in the face of the intense amount of resistance, right? And so, Collins then points out that, you can find black feminist thought in thinkers like Sojourner Truth, right? And she writes in poems, right? And so here you're not going to find the sort of traditional academic form, but you're nonetheless finding an articulation from people about, like, what makes someone a woman, or what makes someone live a valuable life, or what is the best way to live in the face of extreme kinds of oppression, right? And one thing that Patricia Hill Collins points out is that the black feminist tradition is intended to be a critical social theory. So what does that mean? Well, it means that it's a theory about society, right? But it's one that is intended to, in some way, change society, right? Marx has this famous quote about philosophy where he says that philosophers up to this point have only interpreted the world, right? The point is to change it, right? And typically this is taken as the motto for what critical theory is. Critical theory is an attempt to come to a diagnosis of the power structures of existing society with an aim towards changing them, right? And so another word that I've written down here is intersectionality, which is a concept not originally developed by Patricia Hill Collins, but by Kimberly Crenshaw. And essentially, intersectionality is a theory that says that black women have a particular perspective because of the fact that they face oppression both as women and for their blackness, right? And the intersection of these two kinds of oppression often leaves the unique circumstances of black women invisible to everyone else, right? So just as an example, it's sort of the legal background for Kimberly Crenshaw's development of this concept is that, if you say, is that, like, in many cases, whenever you are making a claim, right, a legal claim that you're being discriminated on the basis of being black, or on the basis of being a woman, or on the basis of being queer, or on the basis of being trans, and so on, right, you have to pick one, right? And, like, that doesn't necessarily always jive with the cases, right? Some people are killed, say, for being black trans women, right? And so in that case, the question is, like, were you discriminated against on the basis of your race, or on the basis of your sex, or on the basis of your sexuality, right? That sort of question is not very easy to answer, and it seems like what we should really dispel is the presupposition that we need to give a singular answer to that sort of thing, right? And so normally oftentimes black feminist thought is based on what is called a standpoint epistemology, which holds that the unique circumstances that black women face in, our contemporary American situation sort of provides them with the resources to develop a critical social theory. So, a way of understanding, analyzing, and then hopefully changing the oppressive structure of our political society, right? And so often these theorists live in what Collins calls alternative institutional locations, right? Audre Lorde, for example, who is a very important author for the black feminist tradition, was a librarian, right? And so you don't always see thinkers who I believe genuinely deserve to be called philosophers really existing or living in philosophy departments, right? If philosophy is the love of wisdom, then wisdom is something that's pursued not merely in institutional settings, but in alternative institutional settings or even non-institutional settings, right? And similarly, I think that we should really, I wrote down here, philosophy versus sophism, because I think that we should really think about this situation as ultimately being pretty similar to that of Socrates, right? Socrates, too, had to sort of exist outside of existing institutions, and his philosophy essentially took a counter-institutional form, right? At least that's that's the conclusion that the people of Athens came to, and why they put him to death, right? And similarly, this week I think that we're sort of getting an introduction to critical theory, which most people think begins with Karl Marx, right? In an attempt to think in a non or counter-institutional way about what's wrong with our existing society, what would it mean to avail ourselves of these ills, right? And what does it mean to live a good life in a society that seems wrong, right? At least in the diagnosis of many authors. Okay, I hope that this week's reading was interesting to you. Next week, we're going to be discussing sex and sexuality with Freud, Foucault, and Feinberg. So I hope you enjoy.